everyone. This is Charles Desmond. It's good to welcome you again to another one of our Inversant Insight conversations. I'm looking forward to our talk today, which is going to be, I think, quite interesting, and I think all of you who are listening are going to enjoy the presentation that we'll share. Let me just say quickly as we open, I'm the CEO of Inversant. We're based in Boston, Massachusetts, and we're a parent-centered organization that works, unfortunately, I've got a phone ringing in the background. We're a parent-centered organization that works to help parents make decisions that are in the long-term interest of their children. I'm going to actually pause for just a second because I think I can turn this phone off. I'll be right with you. Thank you very much for your patience. It's not good when that happens, but there's always a technical thing that happens. Today we're going to be joined by three outstanding presenters who are going to join with us in a deeper conversation about the challenges that parents, families, school administrators, people in philanthropy, people in government are all grappling with, which is how do we make our education system work for all citizens in the country? How do we ensure that they have the resources, the supports, and the tools that they need in order to graduate and become effective and productive members of our society? Right now, we're struggling with that issue. In Inversant, we're particularly and acutely aware of this because we see so many families that are trying to figure out how they can get the resources together and the supports necessary to get their children into college and into careers and professions that are associated with higher education. This is the driving force in the country today. It's also the driving force that's causing the global arms race for talent that's taking place all over the world. So here in the United States, we're taking this issue very seriously and trying to reconcile how and what ways we can make our education system more democratic, more open, more available to more of our citizens who are desperately needed at this time to prepare this country for the challenges that lie ahead. So joining me today in our conversation are three, as I said earlier, three outstanding people. Let me just quickly turn to their quick bios. If you want to learn more about them, you can go to our Inversant website or follow the tracks on this conversation, and you can get much deeper background information on our clearly outstanding presenters. But first of all, let me mention Viviann and Anguiano. She's the Associate Director of Postsecondary Education at the Center for American Progress. Viviann has previously worked with the Alliance for a Better Community, the Partnership for Los Angeles Schools, Illinois Student Assistance Commission, and Loyola University Chicago's Arup Bay College. A proud daughter of Mexican immigrants and a first-generation college graduate, Viviann earned a bachelor's degree in sociology from Loyola University in Chicago and a master's in education policy and management from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Joining Viviann will be as well Anna Martinez, policy analyst at the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center. With a background in educational teaching and youth program coordination, Anna focuses on educational research and analysis at MassBudget. She earned a BA in public policy from the Ohio State University and a master's of curriculum instruction from Boston University. Finally, I'd like to mention my colleague and friend, Bahar Akman Imboden, who's the co-founder and managing director of the Hildreth Institute. Bahar leads Hildreth Institute's nonprofit research and advocacy organization working towards a fairer and more sustainable higher education system. She has her PhD in political science from McGill University and will also join our Inversant team in 2021 as Director of Research and Impact. So let me open up our conversation by turning to Viviann, who will give us a picture of the situation that we're presently seeing ourselves in the United States with regards to higher education, finance, and affordability. Why and in what circumstances lead us into the challenges that we're facing right now today relative to resources that are needed, so desperately needed to sustain and maintain our higher education system. So Viviann, thank you very much for joining us, and we're looking forward to hearing your comments.
Well, thank you, Charles, and I want to thank Inversant also for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you and with my fellow co-panelists. I'll first start off by saying that, I think a good way to frame this conversation is to think about how we got to the current student loan crisis that we're in right now. The 2008 Great Recession really is when we started to see the massive amount of student loan debt just get larger and larger. And the reason is because at the time, the economy was doing very poorly, and we had to think about what were solutions to be able to ensure the economy could recover. In that time period, what we saw is that higher education institutions and states who fund their public higher education institutions, because they were in such dire economic circumstances, had to cut state funding. And that has really led to an increase and a spike in tuition costs. And what we see today is really that the increase of cost of college has really fallen on students, and the way they pay for it is through student loans. So I think that is a really critical thing to consider here, particularly right now where we are seeing that we're in an economic recession from the coronavirus pandemic. And the question becomes, how will we deal as a country, as policymakers, as people in our communities, how will we deal with this crisis now? The other thing I'd like to just mention here is that the student loan crisis is a racial equity issue. It's an economic issue. Right now, the student loan debt is up to $1.5 trillion held by 43 million Americans. That's 1 in 5 people in this country. There are 1 million borrowers who go into default on their student loans, which leads them to having very poor credit, having their wages garnished, Social Security taxes garnished as well from their taxes. And about half of Black borrowers default on their loans. So we know that this student debt crisis is going to exacerbate with the coronavirus pandemic and the economic recession we're currently in, and that we have to be very intentional about how we address racial equity on this issue.
Thank you very much. I think that gives us what I call a 35,000-foot picture of what's the presenting situation that we see at the national level. I think if I had one quick follow-up question, it would be, do you see, as you look across the country, there's a broad awareness of this particular landscape that you played out for us? Is this a shared understanding that people are recognizing that it's not just problem for Massachusetts or Connecticut or New Hampshire? This is a national set of circumstances that are affecting all communities across the country?
Absolutely, Charles. I think that, the presidential campaigns, especially, were able to bring about this issue. And we're seeing a lot of movement in both the House and the Senate right now, with mostly on the Democratic side, who, Senator Warren and Schumer have both proposed a bill that would cancel $50,000 of debt for students. Many advocates on the left wing of the Democratic Party, as well as other parts of the Democratic Party, have been pushing for the Biden administration to cancel debt for students. And we've also seen a commitment from the president-elect to cancel some amount of student debt for Americans in this country. So I think that all that to say, there's obviously, I think, a lot of division and polarization in the country. And so I think that it definitely is a national issue that's getting a lot of attention. The question is, how do we galvanize support across the American public to see that this is really an issue affecting all people?
Thank you very much. That's a perfect landing ground for me to turn to Anna, who can share with us some thoughts about what's happening in the state of Massachusetts with regards to this framework that's just been laid out by Viviann. What would be helpful for us to hear, Anna, is what's the thinking right now that's going on in the state of Massachusetts? relative to this particular issue in higher ed. Many states across the country look to Massachusetts as a leader because it's always been able to innovate its way out of the challenges that it's been confronted with. This is one that's been particularly difficult. So I'm wondering, from the seat that you're sitting in, what do you see? What do you think is happening? And are we moving in the right direction with regards to resolution of these challenges?
Yeah, thanks, Charles. It's really great to be here. Really great to be here with y'all. And I kind of want to jump off of what Viviann was saying earlier and say that the trends that we're seeing nationally are no different in Massachusetts. If we look back to the recession of 2001, Massachusetts cut close to $3 billion from all public services. And that was absolutely true for higher education in Massachusetts as well. And in fact, in every recession, higher ed has just been cut time and time again. We haven't even seen any type of funding being restored to our fiscal year 2001 levels. So I kind of want to start by affirming that. And I also want to say that in the most recent budgets that we've seen from the State House, we haven't seen any cuts yet to higher education, but it's also really important to point out that we're only seeing higher education being level funded. And what that means is we'll be receiving the same amount of funding as last year. And that's not going to be sustainable, especially because last year there wasn't a pandemic, right? We didn't have students who were struggling with being on campus, being off campus, having these technical issues. So that is kind of a really big thing I want to kind of focus on, is that our funding is not where it needs to be. And it's something that we haven't seen a lot of traction around. And that's something that I think as a state, we need to really focus on, is that higher education is going to be something that the state really needs, that the Commonwealth really needs for economic recovery, especially given our circumstances with COVID-19.
Let me ask a question, and I mean, thank you very much for that presentation, and I think that that's absolutely right on the mark. The question is that do you see in your travels around the state that there's a growing awareness of the extent of the problem with regards to higher education, in the sense that this underfunding has long it filters down to deeper problems that will be down the road that we'll face as a nation? How do we maintain our economic competitiveness? How do we have the talent that we need to drive our businesses and our economy if that pipeline of talent that's been coming through our public and private institutions starts to be curtailed? And certainly that's the case that we're seeing right now, is that our enrollments are declining because of the particularly COVID in particular, but there are other factors as well, as we've heard in presentations on the show, that students are taking second guesses about whether or not higher education at this time is the best thing for them to do. So I know that Bahar is going to get into that aspect of our discussion, but do you see a deepening sense of awareness of the fact that this problem is probably a little more critical right now than it may have been even a year ago?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I'm seeing it specifically in our grassroots groups, our community groups, our student advocates, especially. The students are really starting to speak up about these issues, and they're starting to share their stories, which have been completely and just completely something that folks need to hear. And I am hopeful that our policymakers and our state leaders will listen to these students and listen to professors and to our campus leaders on what they need and how the state can help our students and our campuses have resources that they need.
Thank you very much. Again, let me say that's a perfect platform for us to hear from Bahar, who has been closely monitoring these issues and looking at them over the last decade, quite frankly. And so it's wonderful to turn to you, Bahar, to talk about at the grassroots level of how it's impacting students and families, communities that we're all concerned about here in the state of Massachusetts. What do you see unfolding, and what indicators do you think we should be particularly paying attention to right now?
Thank you, Charlie, and thank you everyone for being here. It's exciting to talk about these issues that are so timely right now, especially looking at the economic downturn that we are experiencing due to the pandemic. I think what we've been seeing even before the pandemic was a demand for a more affordable higher education that reduces the debt burden. I think we've done multiple focus groups, multiple seminars on multiple campuses, and students really respond well to the notion of developing a proposal that would eliminate the need to borrow, and if not possible, greatly reduce the need to borrow. Because, and I think that that's a demand that is quite fair, because when we look at the previous research, it actually aligns well with what we want for the greater good for society and for the economy in general as well. So research has clearly demonstrated that college affordability can significantly impact students' educational pathways by supporting their post-secondary enrollment, persistence, and of course degree attainment. But unfortunately, the trends are clear that lower income students and students of coming from minority groups have a lower persistence and degree completion rates compared to their higher income peers or their peers coming from better endowed, like better resourced zip codes even. So the financial burden created by this unmet need is one of the main contributing factors for this gap in college access and degree attainment. And it doesn't even stop just with college access, success and attainment. It continues after the degree, because when we look at wealth formation, we also see that all these groups who have to borrow extensively to afford that degree are burdened by debt and unable to form wealth at the same rate to their white peers, for instance, or their higher income peers who have been able to rely on family existing wealth to kind of build and repay their loans, even if they have them, and kind of grow their financial stability. So it's very important now when we look at COVID and as we emerge from the pandemic and start to rebuild our economy, we must use education's potential to build a stronger economy, but also to have this powerful engine of upward mobility. And when we look at the solutions that have been put out there so far, we see a lot of effort being put into a tuition-free approach. Having tuition-free program is definitely a good step in the right direction. And I think it's a valuable effort. But when we look at, for instance, the populations we have served at Inversant, we see that just the costs don't end with tuition and fees. They only represent a certain segment for like a quarter or to maybe 40% of the total cost of attending college. So I think that this just focus on tuition and fees, unfortunately distracting us a little bit from the real financial and also non-financial barriers that is currently preventing many students from accessing and obtaining a higher education credential without being burdened by debt. So I think we need to champion more proposal that looks beyond tuition and fees and try to address this unmet need that leads to opportunity gap, that exacerbates existing inequalities and widen the gaps, frankly.
Let me pick up on a thought that's embedded in the point that you just made, which is to talk about the costs that go beyond just tuition and fees. I think our general public, when they think about students going to college, you say, well, they got a tuition waiver, and they got money that was helping them pay their fees, and so therefore that should be enough, and that they'll be successful in college. But I think that sometimes what people lose sight of the fact of is that these other costs that students have to bear, and this is assuming that some students have families, some students have extended families, some students have children of their own that they have to raise while they're attending school. And if they can't pay the rent, and they can't have transportation expenses, and they can't put food on the table, and they can't pay bills that everyone in our society has to face, these are impediments for them sustaining their time in school. And so I think that perhaps we need to do a little bit better job of trying to communicate to the broader public what are the differentials in circumstances that students who have families who perhaps have wealth, who can pay those extraneous expenses, and students who don't. And so do you have thoughts about that? And let me just put a point on that. For students who do confront those situations, doesn't that contribute greatly to the dropout rate or the stopout rate that low-income students are having? Many people get upset about that. They go, well, they're not completing school, they're not really committed. Well, is it the fact that these other factors that we're not paying as much attention to are creating circumstances where sustaining their academic programs is very difficult to maintain?
I mean, absolutely. And as I was mentioning just before, like tuition can be only 24% of a public 2-year kind of degree, or 40% of the total cost of attendance of the 4-year public degree. And just so that we understand what we're talking about when we say cost of attendance, it includes, of course, the usual books, supplies, computer, software, internet access now that everybody is home. But there is also a living cost for allowance, which cover living cost allowance, which cover room, board, and other living expenses such as transportation, healthcare, personal care, and of course for all the what's called the non-traditional students, which are not that non-traditional anymore. There's actually the majority of them. We see other costs such as childcare or looking after a dependent. Inability to attend full-time because they have to work or look after someone else, which means that sometimes they are even not able to access the full financial aid because some grants will have the eligibility requirement that you attend full-time. So it kind of becomes a chicken and an egg problem where if I don't attend full-time, I can't access to the financial aid. But I wasn't able to attend full-time because I had to work on the side, or I have to look after my child or some other dependent. So I think there is this reality of the it's no longer the privileged kind of young student coming out of high school directly enrolling to college. We have a lot of different personal circumstances that are not necessarily taking into account when the formulas allocate the EFC number that can be also quite not in line with what actually parents can pay. Same with the cost of attendance figure can also be quite off, and that's set by the college. So I think there too, Viviann, I don't know what you have in terms of federal level policy, but I think there's a lot of research showing that the cost of attendance can be quite either undervalued or overvalued, and doesn't help students budget correctly their financial resources.
Let me switch back again, and thank you very much, Bahar. That's very, 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 very helpful. And I have many questions, as you know, that I could direct towards you because we're colleagues and we work together on so many of these issues. But I don't want to leave our other guests out of the conversation. So, Anna, I'd like to come back to you based on what Bahar has just been talking about with regards to the disproportionate impact on, sadly, I mean, it's just, people say sometimes that demography is destiny. So the Commonwealth of Massachusetts is becoming a much more diverse state. It has many, many more people from low income, new immigrant populations. So these issues that we're talking about with regards to upskilling broader sectors of our state are critical to the long-term health and vitality of the Commonwealth. So my question is, as you're, I'm shifting a little bit to what are the solutions that we might be potentially developing to address these questions. As you're looking at the state conversations that are taking place, do you feel that you're hearing enough about this changing demography is one of the things that we can address through the education sector? We can better equip our state to deal with the challenges that lie before us if we recognize that the lack of wealth, the lack of resources, and growing segment of our population, we'll cut them off from the most important thing that they need to help make our state stronger and our economy stronger. So are we, from your perspective, are we, one, aware of that, and two, are we building a larger coalition to do something about it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think there are hubs of Massachusetts who are very aware of it, and more likely those are the hubs who are experiencing it, right? But I think that it will always be a fight, and it will always be part of the work to continue educating folks, and to educate folks with numbers and data and facts that show that this is the reality. This is not a myth that folks are making up, right? And to just kind of talk about some of the numbers and some of the struggles that we're seeing, when we're talking about the price of four-year colleges, four-year public colleges in Massachusetts, the net price, so when I say net price, I mean the full tuition, full cost of attendance, as Bahar said, usually that's not extremely accurate. And when we subtract that from the average scholarship or aid that folks are getting, that price of a four-year education in Massachusetts is close to 40% of Latinx and Black families' median household income. And when we compare that to 20% of a white family's median household income, you see the clear disparity there. And then even moving forward, when we talk about equity within public higher education, we know, and it is a fact, that our students of color are more likely to attend these public institutions. And then again, just jumping off of what Bahar said, because she said so many great things, the demographics that we're seeing in Massachusetts is completely changing. We have our non-traditional students who are really a huge part of our public higher education sector now. 1 in 5 undergraduate part-time students are actually working parents in Massachusetts. So that's something that we need to consider and we need to think about when we're crafting these policy solutions. And even just to take it a step further, when we look at students who are immigrants, they're more likely to be the age of 25 or older. And when we're looking at our undocumented students, are being forced to pay out-of-state tuition rates, even if they kind of check off the boxes for every other in-state eligibility requirement. And even a step further, our DACA students, and for a matter of fact, our undocumented students, they can't apply for any type of aid. Viviann, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe even on a federal level, especially on a state level, and a lot of institutions don't offer any type of aid for these students. So when we're looking at, again, through the equity lens, these are our students who make up a huge percentage of our population who are receiving little to no help. And to kind of circle back to your question, I think that, yes, people who are going through this, people who are going through this know this, and they're fighting the good fight, and they're the ones on the ground who are advocating and kind of pushing this information forward. But I think that there is still a lot of work to be done, especially in Massachusetts, which, as you all have said before, the country and the nation kind of look towards Massachusetts as this really progressive state. So there's a lot of work to be done.
Well, I'm very glad to hear that. Usually this is a point where I like to make a small commercial for our organization. And I do want to say that at Inversant, we are very, very concerned about keeping ourselves very close to the ground with regards to our conversations with families and our conversations at the community-based level, so that we can see what, in fact, is happening in the everyday lives of people that we're concerned about. And so our work is rooted in this strategy, because that's the only way that we can get the kind of data, the information, the insights that are critical for us to make the case for the issues that we're talking about today. And the fact is, if you're not developing talent, you potentially are not helping the talent that we need to strengthen our economy and strengthen the vitality of our communities. And so it's therefore critical for us in Massachusetts, who created the first public schools and the higher education system in the country, to recognize that our own community is being impacted by these challenges that we're talking about today. Let me, if I can, so I was saying my commercial, which is to say that's what Inversant does, but I want to say that the work that Bahar has been doing at the Hildreth Institute, which has been doing the background research and studies on these issues, are all aimed at how do we get greater information and more information that we can share with the broader public about the implications of the challenges that we're talking about, and how do we create a narrative that allows us to bring people on board to work collaboratively with us to address these issues. And I should finally say that we also have within our family of programs the great work that's been going on in Zero Debt Massachusetts, which has been aimed at talking with broader constituencies across the state of Massachusetts about the corrosive effect and impact that student debt and cost is having on our communities. And so these efforts all are built around broadening the conversation so that we can build greater community involvement on resolving the education challenges that we're facing in Massachusetts. And so if I can, I'd like to switch back to the 35,000 foot level. Anna, there's been talk that one of the potential solves, S-O-L-V-E, solves of the challenges that we're facing right now is to take a deeper look at this debt cancellation question. There's so much tension about this whole question about debt cancellation. And I'm just wondering if you could give us some sense from your perspective of how the conversation is being framed around the question about debt cancellation.
Are we talking from a state level or from a federal level?
I meant to direct that to Viviann because I wanted to get that.
I thought so, yeah.
I'm sorry for doing that, Viviann. I do know that you're the national policy expert on this matter.
No. So Anna, feel free to jump in on the state level. So one thing that I just want to add quickly here before I address your question, Charles, is something to build on this discussion of cost is, the Center for American Progress organization I work for, we advocate on Capitol Hill for progressive policy solutions in the higher education space. And we recently put out a report called Beyond Tuition that really amplifies why this issue of cost is so important. And one thing I want to highlight to build on what my fellow co-panelists have both said is just that this issue is especially important at the community college level because the cost of non-academic expenses like food, rent, and transportation are often far greater than the price of tuition and school fees at the community college level. And this results essentially in the dividing line between success and failure in the American higher education system being hunger and childcare and housing. And so I just want to emphasize the importance of community colleges there. And to get to your question, Charlie, I think, one thing that's important to consider about this debt cancellation discussion is that it really goes hand in hand with affordability of college. And I think this is something Americans are really hungry for. People are experiencing how difficult it is and unaffordable it is to go to college and complete a degree. And there's really, 4 sort of equity issues that I'd highlight in the debt cancellation space. One being that any debt cancellation proposal really must address borrowers who do not complete their education. And the reason is because many of those who default on their loans have not completed their degree. And so they have debt without a degree. And we know that this is a really bad place to be. The second group of students that we should really have an eye towards and with an equity lens when we're talking about debt cancellation is Black borrowers. Research shows that the typical Black borrower has made no progress on their loans after 12 years of having that student loan. We know that Black borrowers also have higher debt levels compared to their white peers, have a harder time paying off those student loans, and end up in default at a rate 4 times higher than that of their white peers. The third group of students that I highlight here are students with dependents who have already been mentioned, so student parents. And student parents make up about 30% of those who have defaulted on their loans, and many of whom are single parents. Many of those people are also mothers of color. And then the fourth group of students that I think are important to think about when we talk about debt cancellation are Pell Grant recipients. The reason is because, and Pell Grants are a federal program that are meant to help low-income students afford college. And 90% of students who have defaulted on their loans have received a Pell Grant. And so I want to just highlight here that there's a lot of overlap and intersectional identities across these groups. And we have to think about the racial, gender, and economic identities of these students and recognize here that debt cancellation is really about affecting the most vulnerable. So I don't know if that answers your question, if there's anything you want me to build on there, Charlie, but that's sort of what I would say are sort of the values by which any debt cancellation proposal should be driven by.
I think that you've answered the question brilliantly, quite frankly, because it then begs the question then, how do you develop what steps can you advise and recommend to us as we think about how do you build coalitions to take steps to address that challenge when the subpopulation groups that are most affected by it are low-income and minority communities who are at the heart of many of the problems that we're seeing across the nation. Anyway, this has certainly been amplified by what we're seeing with COVID. It wouldn't surprise me that in the very same communities that we see so many COVID fatalities are communities in which we're going to see many students who are also struggling with the challenges that we're discussing. But the question that draws out of that, which we're all committed and concerned about, is in light of that, do you see at the federal level a broadening awareness of, through the equity lens, that we have certain issues that are impacting segments of our population in the higher education space that aren't affecting others, and that as a policy issue, we've got to come up with strategies somehow or another to address those concerns. What's the appetite for that type of thinking right now?
Absolutely, Charlie. I think there is a lot of appetite to do this work, and there are also a lot of solutions. I think oftentimes, your question was rooted in how do we galvanize and how do we build coalition. And I'm a former organizer, have served Latino families in Chicago and Los Angeles in earlier part of my career, and I think that there's a lot of work happening on the ground, and there's a lot of mobilization happening on the ground. The issue here is an issue of political will and political courage. I think that there are a lot of solutions. There are a lot of people at the table. And one thing that I think we have to push for is how do we as advocates, as residents of Massachusetts or wherever you live, how are you engaging your elected officials to ensure that they are also a part of these solutions? And I think Massachusetts is a really interesting place because you have a Republican governor, but some of the most progressive members of Congress also come from Massachusetts. And so I think that there's a lot to say about how we engage our elected officials to ensure that they are representing the interests of the interests of students and the interests of borrowers. Thank you.
Well, I'm glad that you said that Massachusetts is a very progressive state. That what brings me back to my question to Anna is that do you perceive that there actually is a progressive wing, a progressive movement in Massachusetts that's taking on these challenges? And as a result of the work that you're doing, should we be optimistic about what lies ahead of us right now, or do we have to re-energize and remobilize ourselves to get more involved in this conversation at the grassroots level?
Yeah, it's a very loaded question. So I think that on a level, Massachusetts is a very progressive state. I think for the most part, our citizens are very progressive. Like we've spoken to before, the demographics of Massachusetts are very progressive. And I think a lot of it goes to what Viviann was saying about political will and political courage. And again, I am hopeful, given the folks that I've met, given the coalitions that I've been in, that there will be a push for this, and that students, families, advocates, professors, faculty see this issue as a real problem. But I do think that it is maybe a longer road than some people think to getting to some of that political will and political courage.
Well, I think that I love the grassroots organizing perspective that you brought to the table, Viviann. And as you were talking, I said the last person that I heard talk like that about being a community organizer and bringing that message to the American public ended up in the White House. So I want to just say, please continue talking as you're talking, because I think your voice is very critical and very important and quite persuasive. So
a fellow Chicagoan, thank you.
Well, we won't let that point go by us. So Bahar, you've been probably closer than anyone in our network, in the Inversant family network, to this grassroots work that's going on. From your perspective, is our voice is it resonating? Are we getting buy-in? Do you think that what kinds of thoughts do you have with regards to your assessment of how well we're doing right now in making our case in Massachusetts about the severity and the importance of this issue? Is the political will there? Is the political courage there, as you see it at the grassroots level, to move ahead?
I mean, I think absolutely. I really think that there is an energy around this notion of having public higher ed properly funded. I think that's there. I think there is a lot of energy for any solution that talks about debt-free college, zero debt college. There's also a significant group that is very, very organized around this universal right to public higher ed, where tuition and fees should not be an issue, and that's a right. So I think that what I find a little bit tricky in Massachusetts is that we have a lot of non-for-profit organizations that are very well endowed and that are educating a lot of a diverse student body. But sometimes Massachusetts kind of hides behind that. And I think that forgets a little bit that our public institutions are really suffering. When we look at our public institution, our flagship is no longer really serving any low income. It's become so expensive and so selective. So I think that there is this need and this desire to see our public institutions, including community colleges, being better funded. So that's how we have seen a lot of groups coming together, trying to kind of find a solution, either a bold solution that would really ask debt-free, tuition-free college, and let's start from here, let's put our demands there. But also we start looking at shorter-term solutions. As Anna said, some of these very bold solutions might require time and courage and really convincing that that's a good investment. So a bit of maybe of that kind of research will be also our goal. But the other point is also, what are we going to do in the short term? What are we going to do to respond to the COVID situation, the emergency aid that students need to stay on track, to not drop out, because it becomes a vicious circle. If a student starts dropping out or not enrolling, colleges will be even more in trouble financially. And how are we going to get out of that hole is a big issue too. So I think there is energy for both, but it's also a very difficult time because there's competing priorities because of COVID. But I really think that there is a desire here among a lot of grassroots organizations, a lot of progressive organizations to come together and work together on this to make sure that we can come on top of this economic crisis and also redress some of the disparities, racial disparities, economic disparities we've been witnessing here in Massachusetts?
Well, I'll just throw it as an open-ended question, because on this program, Inversant Insights, we draw people from a broad spectrum of backgrounds and experiences. We have students who are presently right now in college. We have family members who have children that are in the pipeline thinking about college. We have academic administrators who are running public and private institutions. We have policy leaders who are listening in just to sort of hear what we're thinking about and what we're talking about. And we have people in philanthropy who are listening to see where can they weigh in, what kinds of things might they be able to do to help address these questions. But the big point that I think keeps resonating with me is how do we bring these broad constituencies together in a deeper conversation about where we are right now and how we can collectively amplify our voices in order to recognize that the foundation under which we as a society function is built on our education system in America. It's the great equalizer in this country, is to have a democratically supported and strong education system. And when it starts faltering and fraying in the ways that it is right now, we're opening the doors to problems that are profoundly insignificant to us. So I'm wondering if we have advice to the people who are listening right now to us, what kinds of things would you say to them with regards to what they need to do? What do concerned citizens right now need to do to address the challenges that we're facing in our education system? And I don't want to dismiss the fact that we have issues in K through 12, we had issues in early education and care, but the transition point from the education sector into our broader society happens at our higher education space. So I'm wondering what kinds of advice would you give to folks who are listening today based on what we're talking about? Should they be thinking about doing, and what should they be tomorrow if they were to follow our advice? What would we ask them to do? Let me start with you, Bahar, because you're at the grassroots level and we'd like to mobilize people at the grassroots level.
I think the most important aspect is to share your story, to just talk about your experience and communicate that into your elected officials. Make sure to speak up about the fact that even though this is a public institution, my costs are still this much, I want this education, but explaining your personal story will always make it much more attractive and much more kind of resonating with elected officials, because we need nevertheless a demand that comes also from students and also from parents, that this is no longer a game we want to play. Like, tuition keeps increasing. We confuse prestige with high price of college. So I think it's also a little bit of education on part of us educating a little bit how to look at college pricing. What are the resources that we are having to finance college and to ensure that that families are protected with heavy debt burden or a degree that doesn't pay off, or student loans that have extremely bad terms. So there is a bit of work on our part also to make sure to elevate this issue. But on the individual level, it's always to question the value of public higher education and whether you have access to it. And if you do not have access to an affordable path, speak up. That's the number one thing to do.
Thank you very much. Anna, let me talk to you, because you're trying to pull the strings on the Massachusetts budget, and everyone is lining up trying to say, how do they take a piece of the scarce resources that we have? How do we make the case that higher education is fundamental to the strength of this state? An informed and educated citizenry is critical to who we are as Massachusetts citizens. What are we not doing well enough to make our case stronger for increased investments in our education system? Are the ROIs, are the returns on those investments going to be beneficial to the overall state of Massachusetts? And if so, what can we do to do a better job of making that case?
Yeah, so quickly, I think the biggest thing I want folks to take away from this conversation, or even just from a revenue conversation overall, is looking at the state budget. And so usually when I say let's look at the state budget, people are like, okay, how does this connect? But I really want folks to understand that our state budget is a document of our moral values, right? It's choices that our state leaders make on what are we going to invest in and what are we going to divest from. And over the years, the state has chosen to divest from public higher education. And I want to make it very, very clear that these are choices that folks are making. And so as we've said throughout this whole conversation, there needs to be a choice to invest in public higher education. And like you brought up, there are a lot of folks advocating for a lot of things. And I think the biggest thing that kind of as a Commonwealth, we need to change the conversation around how do we fund this? How do we find funding for this? To why should we and why do we need to find funding for this? And I keep saying find funding, but the reality is there is funding here. Massachusetts is an extremely wealthy state. We know where the funding is. There are wealthy individuals, wealthy corporations who have benefited from tax cuts, tax loops, and other tax dodging policies. So it's time to close up those tax loops and to really look at our tax system in Massachusetts and create systems that allow our wealthy individuals to pay their fair share. And this is just so important because, like we're saying, we need higher education. We need affordable higher education for folks to be able to have opportunities for work, for salaries, to be able to invest in their communities and invest in their economies. And then even just more importantly, from a more technical standpoint, we need a balanced budget, right? So if we see that our public goods need more support, we need more funding for that. And we can't just turn a blind eye towards that, right?
Well, I agree 1,000% with what you said, but let me just ask one quick follow-up to that point. There's an argument, of course, that's been made that higher education is an individual good, so that it benefits the individual. And the question is it a societal good? And I think that if the cases made are being put forward that higher education is an individual good, it's the individual who benefits from a quality education, not the broader society. So therefore, why should broader society take on the responsibility of fueling and paying for this education system? But as a Massachusetts resident, I certainly feel that the reason that people flock to Massachusetts and want to live in the state is because as a state, we have a quality of life and an outlook towards our fellow citizens and our concern about each other that make us unique. And I think not partly that is because it is such a highly educated state, and our education system, public and private, contributes immensely to that. But so my question underneath what you just said is, are we doing enough? Are we doing an adequate enough job of making the case for the societal benefits of our education system and why the return on these investments will be down the road of greater interest to the sustaining the quality of life that we all want to enjoy for ourselves and future generations of citizens in Massachusetts?
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing to think about. And I think that we are starting to get there, right? We are starting to have conversations about folks who are graduating from public institutions are more likely to stay in the state. And when they're staying in the state, they're investing in their communities, they're investing in the economy, they're investing in their local shops, right? So we're starting to have those conversations. But like Bahar said before, I think that we need to kind of push ourselves as personally as research groups or as advocates to have that public education, that when folks are graduating from these public institutions, their experiences that they're having, the networking that they're creating is something that the whole Commonwealth is benefiting from. When states have higher amounts of folks who are college educated, or even not just college educated, but even if they have an associate's degree, even if they have a certificate of some sort, those states tend to have stronger economies. They tend to have higher wage economies, and that's benefiting all of us.
Yeah, I'm certainly in agreement with you, and and obviously I feel very strongly that the points that you're making need to be said and resaid and said some more, because I think that's part of the challenges that we're facing. And I think, Viviann, I know you would probably agree with us that these are conversations that need to be happening across the nation, with regards to the broadest citizenry across the nation, realizing the critical importance of our education system. I mean, where would we be right now if we didn't have the EMTs, the nurses, the people who are working in our hospitals, the drivers who are in the emergency vehicles, the people on our police forces and our fire departments, every citizens who have been educated and committing themselves collectively to having a high quality standard of living in the country. And I think somehow or another, we may be losing a little bit of awareness of this. And I'm wondering, again, what kinds of things can we continue to do that will amplify our voices so that we get more people pulling in the same directions with regards to the importance and critical nature of our education system?
Absolutely. I think, we should also, to speak to the societal impact here, we should also note that since 2008, all of the new jobs essentially went to people with college degrees. And we have essential workers as well who are trained across the education pipeline, from a vocational all the way up through an MD, as you've talked about. And so the importance of higher ed is critical here, not only for our physical health during the pandemic, but for our economic, and I would argue for our health as a nation, as a country to support and see each other as community. I think one thing that folks can do, and I think it's already being done, but that folks can continue to do, is to build coalition across lines of difference. And what I mean by that is that, many in the country see the value of education and of higher education. And it's when we reach across lines of difference that we're really able to make an impact. And I can give you an example at the federal level. This year, we saw, despite having a president who doesn't really agree with a lot of our policy proposals, we were able to make some headway on specific veteran issues. The case being mostly where predatory for-profit colleges, bad actors in higher ed, were preying on veterans and leaving them with high amounts of debt and no degree. There was a lot of advocacy that really happened at the national level. And the reason why that was successful is because civil rights groups, higher education advocacy groups, student debt cancellation groups, and veterans worked together to ensure that veterans could have some progress in what we're seeing in the higher ed space. So I think that's critical to reach across lines of difference. The other thing that I would say to help just sort of keep this issue going is for people to not be satisfied with zero-sum solutions. And what I mean by that is, often you'll hear, well, you'll either get, debt cancellation, or you'll get, affordable college for everyone in the future. You'll either help Latino students or you'll help Black students. You'll either fund minority serving institutions or not minority serving institutions. And I think that that's just oftentimes I think, we are told that is all that's possible. And I want to urge people to not be satisfied with that response from policymakers, from leaders, from people in community, because there really is a lot more that's possible when we work together. To make college affordable on the front end for families, it would require probably a federal-state partnership where the federal government provides money and states and colleges match that money depending on how much wealth that they have. And so that requires collaboration, it requires reaching across lines of difference, and it requires us to not be satisfied with stopgap solutions that really don't get to the root cause of inequality.
Thank you very much for that wonderful statement. And again, I'm telling you, you're from Chicago, I'm keeping my eye on you because there's no telling where this is ultimately going to end up. Let me just say that usually when we get towards the end of our program, which we are right now, I ask you, is there any last points or statements that you'd like to share with our listening audience? Viviann, you just made an outstanding and beautiful statement, and I've taken notes of some of the things that you said so that I can repeat them. But are there any last thoughts that you want to share with us before I bid our listening audience adieu?
I'll just say really quickly that to build on something that Anna mentioned before that is a really important issue to me that I've worked on for a number of years is the barriers that undocumented students are facing in this country are tremendous. They've been vilified for the last 4 years, and as already was mentioned, are not eligible for federal student aid, are not eligible for a lot of benefits at the state level. And so I really want to urge people to think about immigrants and undocumented people as, who are experiencing and are seeing a lot of exacerbated not only hatred but inequality and lack of access to higher ed. So I'll drop in the chat box a recent piece that we wrote that looked at how undocumented students were excluded from CARES Act funding, even though they generated $132 million for their colleges. So I just want to urge people to think about immigrant, Black, Native American, and Latinx communities who are bearing the brunt of the pandemic right now.
Thank you very much. And I just want to put a footnote to what you said earlier. This is exactly one of the zero-sum issues that you were referencing. Somehow or another, if we do something for undocumented immigrants in our education system, that's going to somehow or another hurt somebody else in our education system. We've got to stop that type of thinking and start being the United States of America that provides education to all people that are in this country. So let me turn now to Anna. Any concluding thoughts that you'd like to share or points that you'd like to leave with our audience?
Yeah, well, I wouldn't be an analyst at MassBudget if I didn't end by saying that the state budget is a tool for equity, and that's something that I really, really want folks to take away and to know, and that we have options for progressive revenue. We have more than enough options for progressive revenue, and if folks are seeing that policymakers or legislators are not making choices that they feel need to be made, I would encourage folks to use their vote and use their voice.
And thank you very much, Anna. Bahar, I know that you always want to share the last thought with us, so I'm going to let you have it right now.
Well, I think the only thing I'd like to share is to kind of extend an invitation to any group, anybody, any advocate, even if an individual wants to work on this, they should reach out to us. And we want to build that coalition that is representing a lot of the voices that are in Massachusetts, but also nationally, state to state learning is very important too. So anyone who is as interested in talking about this as we are should definitely reach out to us, and hopefully we can build a stronger voice and change what we don't like.
Bahar, let me just say in closing, first of all, to Viviann, Anguiano, Anna Martinez, and Bahar, this has just been an absolutely wonderful conversation. You all are brilliant women who have great insights to share with our broader audience. And so thank you very much for sharing your time with us today. To our listening audience, let me say also that it's always a delight for us to share time with you and to put our insights in your wheelhouse so that you can share your thoughts with us as well. You know that you can always turn to our Inversant webpage and send any questions, comments, or concerns that you have. If you have suggestions about issues or concerns that you think that we should be talking about in Inversant Insights, please let us know, and we'll certainly follow through with future shows that will focus in on your particular concerns. With that, let me say thank you all very much, our presenters, and to our broader audience. Thank you to our many sponsors who support our work and support our efforts. None of this could happen without your involvement and your concern, and we greatly appreciate it. Take care, happy holidays, and I'm looking forward to seeing you at our next presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.